Everyone is welcome here, it's time to make new friends. Aquavide Uskava, fill your Glencairn. Share a dram with the spirit of Edmonton. Slancha!
Good day, whiskey brothers, whiskey sisters, whiskey friends, and welcome to the Whisky Book Club's fourth book of season 3. And we're here with author Carlo DeVito, author of this book right here, The Spirit of Rye, over 400 expressions to celebrate the Rye revival. And as always, I'm honored to have you, the viewer, with us here today. As a quick aside, I have to say that there are other whiskey book clubs out there right now, but none that delve so deeply as what we're going to do with this author right here over the next 2 and a little bit hours. My name's Dolph. I'm the president of the Alberta Scotch Society, founder of the Whisky Book Club. I'm your host tonight. And for those of you that are a little bit new to the Whisky Book Club, I'll explain. We're a home base. We're a safe place for whiskey geeks like us that love to share a dram and share a passion for reading, mostly about whiskey and whiskey-related books or other alcohol books. We're into that too. This book right here, again, is the 15th book reviewed on the Whisky Book Club, and it's also one of several books that Mr. Carlo DeVito has authored, and let's give you some pictures. So here's one, that one right there. Great book, and these are some heavy tomes. I got to tell you, Carlo, that's some heavy reading.
Lou Bryson says Carlo doesn't write any small books.
no, not at all. And we've got big whiskey. You know what? I've got some pictures too. So let's just throw a couple pictures of these up here. And we've got, well, this is the one we're doing now. So the Spirit of Rye, there's the back of it. And we've got big whiskey. And I noticed on here, I don't have big whiskey, but I noticed the Rebirth of Rye is in this. And I'm guessing this led you into the newest tome.
Yeah, absolutely did. Well, yeah, we'll be talking about that. Absolutely did.
Perfect. All right. So there we go. And we're talking about rye. And this is rye. There's a rye field. That's the rye. And there's the man right there starting us all off. So just a couple things that you need to know about this kind sir. He's editor for some really big names in this industry. My most favorite being Michael Jackson. He also had Salvatore Calabrese, Stephen Van Eycken. You have tons of names of people that you've worked with, which I'd like to talk to you about as well. You're a winery owner, or did you just start? Are you still an owner?
No, I sold mine, but now I am a winemaker for another winery.
Oh, perfect. And
so
festival
my connection to booze never ends.
You did the Hudson Berkshire Beverage Trail, Hudson Berkshire Wine Food Festival that you organize. You're just busy all the time. And right now, you're working on some videos coming out kind of soon too. So we'll talk about that among all the other things that you're doing right now. But let's start with a little introduction. But actually, we don't have to. I already introduced you. But tell me, what do you got in your glass tonight?
Tonight, I'm going to start off with Tamworth. They're out of New Hampshire, and they make a lovely rye that I can never remember how to pronounce. It's this beautiful, beautiful rye, and I don't know what I just did at the bottom, but it's a beautiful rye out of Tamworth. It's named after a mountain in New Hampshire. It's a really gorgeous, lush rye.
All right. Excellent. And I'm Dolph, we know that, and there I am, and that's what
there you are.
Well, I got the single barrel of the Jack Daniels. I went, and that's about halfway done. I haven't really shared this with too many friends, so that half bottle that's all me. I can't.
There you go.
My friends coming over and doing that, and my next one, and I'll do that later too, because I'm going to go into the Dad's Hat.
Oh yeah, love the guys at Dad's Hat. They're just doing such great stuff.
Port
Down in Herm, they're just doing some just tremendous stuff.
Yeah, so
one of my favorite producers.
3 different bottles. I only have 2 open. There's this one, and there's vermouth. It was the vermouth finish that I have as well.
Yes, yes,
it's fun. How you feeling? You good?
I'm feeling good. It's cold. It's cold as heck out here in the Hudson Valley. We're getting our Canadian blast, as it were. It's the high is 22, I think.
22. I got to figure out what we are here.
Oh, yeah, right. There you go.
With the wind chill today,
I don't want to know about the wind chill. It was cold.
Let's go. What is minus 40 degrees Celsius in Fahrenheit?
It just sounds awful.
It does. It's minus 40 Fahrenheit. Sorry, when we get to that, we're equal. So that's that's with the wind chill today. But you know what? It's going to start warming up on us a little bit. We've been in a deep freeze for 2.5 weeks now, and it is a deep freeze.
We've gotten very lucky. We've gotten very lucky, and I've been working down in New Jersey lately, which is a little more insulated. So I've been spoiled rotten, because otherwise up here in the Hudson Valley, it's been pretty darn cold.
Oh, good. That's okay. A little bit of cold in the winter is nice. Nice to have the seasons. I do like that.
You know what?
I lived in Belgium
whiskey
for a
weather
while.
is the way I look at it.
It's good. No, I'm happy. This cold for us will go away, and then we're going to appreciate it a little bit more. And then it's funny. It gets to minus 10, and we're walking around with our jackets open and no hat, no gloves. It's like, this is balmy. It's great. All right, let's start right now. I'm going to pepper you with a couple questions more about your past. So you're a man of many talents. Let's call you farmer, organizer, blogger, writer, editor. You also have several areas of interest: whiskey, rye, obviously one of them, beer, wine, cigars, Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, history, and I think American history mostly, or is it all history?
I'm interested in all history. I was a history editor for many years, and the love of that hasn't gone away at all. Matter of fact, it's kind of wormed its way into all my writing at this point.
Well, you can tell in this book, obviously. It's a big part of it, and I loved it for that reason. I'm a history major, too, so that works out for me. And I'm assuming your attention's a bit torn between all these areas of interest a little bit, but is there one or a few that you always go back to? One of these interests, something that you
I think one of the things, and we were just alluding to it, history is what I always kind of go back to. So it doesn't matter whether I'm talking about Twain or Dickens or, whiskey, wine, sports, because I do write a lot about American football and baseball. Okay. Whatever it is, it's got to involve history, because that's kind of one of my passions. So if anything weaves its way, it's history and dogs, because I'm a big dog nut. So history is really what weaves a lot of my writing together.
All right. And I know you're torn between wine and whiskey a little bit. Is there one that's your vita amoris, your life's?
Oh, that's a tough one. It's a tough one. I grew up in households that really featured wine. So wine was always a part of my life, and my original goal was to have a winery, which I did, and then whiskey grew out of that. It's a long story that I could certainly delve into, but wine was my first love, and I would say whiskey is my mistress.
Oh, done. Perfect. We like it. And reading about the author and your acknowledgments in the book, which are both extensive, I have to say, and very good, I still don't have a great picture of what your roots are. And I think because you've done so much, it was hard to kind of bring that all together in those two, or it'd be a couple pages longer than it already is. I'm going to ask you for an abridged bio. So family background, school, university, first job type thing. And did all of this eventually bring you into the industry, or were you kind of groomed for it anyways?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, there was a family lore that my grandfather made a lot of wine when I was, or before I was born, and certainly after I was born, my great-grandfather. And I grew up going back and forth between Trenton, New Jersey, and Fairfield, Connecticut. It's sort of like the Bronx family, Dead Poets Society. It was a very bizarre childhood, very Dickensian, very Mark Twainish. Many lives lived therein. So very interesting childhood, to say the least. And I ended up going to Fordham University in New York City, which I loved. I loved being in the city, lived in New York City for almost 15 years, moving around. I started out with a number of strange jobs, just like the rest of my life. I did lighting for Alvin Ailey at one point. I was a messenger. I was a street vendor, a truck driver. I did it all, and then eventually worked my way into the publishing business. And I became an editor after that, and my first job as an editor was doing history and science. And so that catapulted me. And through the years, I was really lucky. I worked with people like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Dan Rather, Michael Lewis, D. Brown. There were just a huge number of people. Stephen Hawking. I got to work with a lot of people. I ended up working with 6 different Pulitzer Prize winners during the course of my publishing career. Very thrilled. Gil King, Michael Kamen, James McPherson. So I really was very lucky in that way. And again, I was a huge history buff, and so that really fed into what I was interested in. And what happened was eventually I went to a small publisher. I was at Macmillan for many years. And then I left after I'd gone to McGraw-Hill for a little while, and I went to a small publisher in Philadelphia called Running Press. And the owner, Buzz Teacher, was a tremendous businessman, publisher, just an incredibly smart guy. And he had this love for whiskey and wine. And we did what we called sin books back in those days. And this, you're talking about the early 90s, mid-90s. We did 2 books with Gary Reagan, Gaz. We did a bourbon companion and a cocktail companion, a martini companion. We worked with Michael Jackson. We did 2 books with Michael Jackson. And those were hugely, those made a huge impression on me, those people. And eventually got to work with the folks at Cigar Aficionado over at M. Shanken and with Wine Spectator. So I shepherded the book programs for those 2 brands at Running Press. So that was my introduction to that genre. And later on, I moved on to a place called Sterling, several publishers later, and I developed something called Sterling Epicure, which was a line of books that was focused on wine, beers, and spirits and cooking. So I got to work with Kevin Zraly, Oz Clark, Matt Kramer. I got to work with, Stephen Beaumont, who's one of the big beer writers in Canada and around the world. Got to work with Joshua Bernstein, another beer writer. Mr. Calabrese, who's just a fantastic gentleman. Got to work with Jim Meehan from Please Don't Tell. So I had this incredible run of being able to work with just some tremendous people. Did the New York Times Book of Wine, did the New York Times Book of Cocktails, worked with the edibles community, Good Housekeeping, Esquire, in which I got to rub shoulders with Dave Wondrich. I mean, it was a really lucky time in my life, and got to work or be with a lot of other people. At the same time, what was great was working in New York City at that time, I got to go to a lot of wine and whiskey tastings. I was always invited to those things. I worked with Clay Risen on his book on whiskey, bourbon, and rye. And those were really exciting tastings, I have to say. And so that was kind of, my entree into all of this. And it slowly evolved, and I got to know more and more and learn more and more from these tremendous folks. And that kind of blossomed. And my first real whiskey book, I was like 75% editor and maybe 25% contributor to the new single malt whiskey, which was my first big book. It's a tome. We had 45 whiskey writers from around the world participate in this project. And the idea was single malts now being made all over the world, not just in Scotland. And so this was the attempt to really try to coalesce what was going on in single malt at that time. And it's still pretty on target. I mean, obviously people have come up with new expressions, et cetera, but it's still pretty much on target. And I was really lucky because I got to work with even more people through that and meet more people. And then from there, it was the jump to Big Whiskey, which is, Big Whiskey was the it's all about the distilleries of Kentucky and Tennessee. Just to give you an idea, Tennessee 20 years ago had 3 distilleries, and now they have 45 or 50. So the explosion, and of course in Kentucky, you've seen a similar explosion. I mean, you've seen at least a dozen old distilleries brought back to life, as well as new ones being built. So the when I first started doing Big Whiskey, it's now in its 2nd edition. I think that the smallest renovation of a major distillery was Four Roses, and that was $70 million. So when the boom hit, the boom really hit. It was really amazing. And of course, there's been new distilleries as well. So Big Whiskey was a big thrill, and that really catapulted me forward. And in that book, we started talking about the rebirth of rye. And there you go. The rye book just seemed like such an obvious next step with what was going on. And that's a whole world unto itself. And of course, as you alluded to, I write a lot about Twain and Dickens. I do have, in my future projects, I have 5 books I'm working on right now. So, and one of them's a Twain, and one of them's a Dickens, one of them's a football book, and oh gosh, what's the other one? Another one is about the wineries, distilleries, and breweries of New England. So, just a few things going on.
Just a few. Well, it keeps you busy, and if you're anything like me, you can't keep your attention on one thing, and then when you're doing one,
the attention span of a cranberry. Yeah, exactly.
And then the next is going. Let's go back to writing though, because you had all those influences in your life. You were exposed to all these people, these fantastic writers, organizers.
Tremendous opportunity.
Who do you go to when you write your first book? Who are you handing that to that you trust, that's willing to do it for you? Because you've mentioned 20 people that anybody would love to have read their book and give them opinions on. So who did you go to with your very first book?
I have to say, in the last 3 or 4 years, the two greatest helps, period, have been Davin de Cargamo and Lou Bryson. Those 2 gentlemen, especially Lou. Lou's been so patient with me. I'm sure there are like half a dozen times he wanted to smack me and be like, "Go, just go away." But he's been an absolute treasure. And Davin has 2, and those 2 gentlemen at the very least. And then Richard Thomas has been a huge help as well. So those 3 guys have really been have had my back. Other people have also been tremendous, and I don't want to exclude anybody, but those 3 guys, if I have an issue, it's one of those 3 gentlemen that I'm calling first, and they've been super patient with me.
Excellent. Well, we did Davin's 2 books. I did the last book with Lou, and I am Lou on next week. He hasn't gotten back to me yet, so I asked him, and if you wanted him and Sam Komlanek. Oh yeah, I always mess up his name, and it's
they're great guys though. Those are the guys you want for sure. And I would say Stephen Beaumont was really helpful on this book as well. By the way, he was incredible.
Well, I'll get his email, and we'll see if we can get them on the After Dram right to the end. And I've got a couple distillers as well that you worked with or quoted in the book that love to come on. So I'm good. But your very first book, who did you give that to look it over?
Oh, it was Lou Bryson, and I gave the entire Canadian section to Davin. I'm not kidding. Those 2 guys. That's it. Those are the. If you're going to go to somebody, those 2 guys. My first whiskey book. I
mean your first book that you ever put yourself out there with.
Oh well, the first book wasn't. My first books weren't whiskey books though.
No, that's
my first books were. Oh gosh, you're gonna laugh. My first actual book was on goldfish, and I wrote it with a guy named Greg Scommel, who's now the star of Shark Week. And he was a childhood friend, and he was an oceanographer at Woods Hole. And I said, "Look, I'm going to write this. I got to sign this book." It was a freelance thing. They needed somebody who just was a good general writer, and I had experience with tropical fish at one point. And I said, and they said, "Well, look, you're nobody." And I said, "Well, if I can get the guy from Woods Hole, would that be?" They said, "Oh yeah, well, we trust him, not you. You'll be the writer, and you'll be the authority." And And Greg was a childhood friend, and we've been friends ever since. And he's like I said, he's the guy on Shark Week out there in Martha's Vineyard, and we've been friends ever since. And but that was literally my first book, and he called me back. He's like, "Are you really going to write this book on goldfish?" I said, "Yeah, come on, come on, this will be fun." And we did it.
Help me out. I'll give you booze. I'll feed you.
Yeah, life has strange beginnings.
No, that's a great story. I love that. And yeah, I'm going to get into this. So let's get into the book. Let's delve in here. And what I do a lot, I don't know if you've seen this so much, but I give you a lot of quotes. So here's the first quote.
Okay.
So you quoted Dave Pickerel, master distiller, Maker's Mark, later at Whistle Pig. And you say, "We do have aspirations of being America's grown-up go-to whiskey." What I mean by that is when people are drinking bourbon, start looking for something with more character. It's funny. We want to be there for them as an alternative to Scotch. You continue by saying, and that's exactly what rye is. It's a stepping stone after you've satisfied your sweet tooth on bourbon and you're ready for a more grown-up whiskey. Kind of like learning to drink sweet white wine and then wanting to graduate to Cab Sauv or liking light pilsners and eventually going to craft beer. So that's the quote. So I love and I agree with this. So I'm not trying to pinch you on anything, but as a writer devoted to many spirits and drinks, do you still stand by this? And what do your fellow writers think about this bold statement? It's not.
Oh no, I think it's absolutely true. I believe in this wholeheartedly, and it's not to diss bourbon or any other spirit in any other way, but bourbon is that sort of sweet entry level whiskey, and I still drink bourbon. So that's not to say that I don't drink bourbon at all anymore.
Yeah.
But if you're going to appreciate Scotch, and for me, I went backwards, right? So I had bourbon, and I went straight to single malt because I'd done the book on single malt, and now I was working my way backwards, really learning how to appreciate bourbon all over again, and then rye, and rye is this amazing whiskey. Rye is unlike any other whiskey. If I had to pick a true simile or metaphor or what have you, it would have to be that rye is the Pinot Noir of whiskey. It is the heartbreak grain for a distiller of any kind. It is the most problematic child in the entire realm of grains. And it is the most expressive, not only of place, but there are 22 different kinds of rye that you could choose to make your rye out of. Each one has this different profile. So more than any other whiskey, rye is like wine, and it's an amazing thing. There was a wonderful producer in Minnesota. You fly into Alberta and you drive to his place, because if you try to go into Minneapolis, it'll take you 6 hours to get there. I think he's like 2 hours from Alberta. And I had come up with this list of 22, or I forget what it was around 22 approximately, rye grains. And I kept calling all these professors in different grain schools, sending them my list saying, "Can you tell me if I missed anything?" Nobody was calling me back. And I found this young woman who started a malting company, Empire Malting, up in Minnesota. Okay. And she had formerly worked for Archer's Daniel Midland. And she had said, and so I told her this story when I was interviewing her. She said, "Send me the list." She called me back like 2 minutes later. She said, "I can tell you why nobody's gotten you back to you on your list." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because nobody's assembled this list. Nobody's actually tried to quantify this before." She said most distillers, they call up their grain supplier, and whatever rye they have, they take, because it's a seller's market at this point, because rye has just become so explosive. She said, "But I do have a guy you want to talk to," and that was at Far North Spirits. And he had actually bought 14 of the different rye grains and planted them an acre apiece, and then made separate whiskeys out of each one. So he said, "Send me your notes." And he called me back literally about 15 minutes later. He goes, "Are you ready?" And I said, "What am I ready for?" He goes, "I'm going to give you the tasting notes on those 14 different grains." And it was, I bent I'm sure his wife wanted to kill me because I kept him on the phone for hours. But, that is why rye, to me, is so incredibly expressive. I believe in the terroir of whiskey to begin with. And now you're talking about being able to use different grains. I mean, the bourbon people are only starting to discover that, right? With the different corns, trying to bring back heirloom corn to make bourbon, etc. But here, with especially in the crafts movement, where you've got a smaller ship that turns more quickly, you could pivot more quickly. Trying these new ryes, like bringing back Rosen rye, experimenting with Danko or Musketeer. There's all these different ryes you could try. If you go down south, rye doesn't particularly grow very well, but there are some. There's black rye, and there's another, excuse me, rye that grow down south very well. So those guys are making rye out of that grass. So it's fascinating to see how rye is expanding and growing, and how expressive it is. And you get completely different ryes. And a good version of that is Dad's Hat, which we're going to be drinking later. It's got this wonderfully big, piney kind of note to it. They're using Rosen rye, which is a pre-prohibition grain, and it's fantastic. But then you could try some of these other grains as well, and they just blow you away. So to me, there's never been a better time to drink rye. And I think that rye truly is that great stepping stone. If you do want to go to single malt, or later on to the Isla whiskeys, rye is that stepping stone. But of all of them, I still think it's the most expressive of all the whiskeys.
Well, that leads me right into my next question, which works really well. So thank you very much, Ken, sir. You're reading my mind. So last month, I was doing Whisky Book Club with Dr. Don Livermore, Blending 101 book. So J.P. Weiser's Master Blender. And he had 2 books come out, and that was the second one. And one of our conversations focused on what I thought was the golden age of whiskey. I thought that was now, and what he thought it was, and he gave me his opinion. And we argue all the time, which is great, which I like. But I think it's now. But what a happy surprise it was when I read in your book, when you stated we are at the zenith of American rye whiskeys, the golden age of rye. So can you tell us why? You already did a bit about the grains, but let's talk about the vastness of it. Can you tell me why you think it's the
first time I heard that kind of talk was literally about 10 or 12 years ago. Kevin Zraly, we did his 30th edition of the Windows on the World wine class.
Okay.
And he said, this is the golden age of wine. And he was absolutely right. And you see where distilling has gone, especially in North America. And there's never been a better time to be alive if you enjoy whiskey, ever. Between the large producers, who I think are making better whiskey than they ever have before, and what's going on there, and then between all the craft distillers, you've just got such variety across a large. I mean, and I have to say that was one of the most exciting things about writing about Canada, was that I had no idea all the wild things that were going on up in Canada. I mean, you've just got tremendous variety in a very small industry. It's just the variety has been explosive, and I think the next 5 years in craft distilling up there are going to be just super exciting.
It's the experimentation for me, I think.
Oh, it's fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic, but it's across the board. And I think one of the really exciting parts is that you could say, well, what makes it better now than it was pre-prohibition? Well, you have to remember 1906. I'm going to go back to 1906 for just a moment. Okay. The U.S. government said, okay, we're putting in a purity law, essentially. And what it was the industry had gotten so crazy and so competitive that they were distillers putting in cherry juice, plum juice, pine tar, anything they could to flavor whiskey, even stuff that was not good for you, something that might be lethal in large doses, into their whiskeys to try to give them flavors, etc. And so, number one, it's a lot safer to drink now than it was 100 years ago. That's an important note, I think. But the second part of it is that the science today is so much better. And I have to say, this is the same. Kevin Zraly, one of the reasons I asked, I was talking with Kevin Zraly about his quote about wine. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, what's so different about wine now than it was maybe 50, 60 years ago? And he said, that's an easy answer. He said, winemakers now talk to each other. He said 50, 60 years ago, the Bordelais and the Burgundians, they would never talk to each other, especially about making wine. They hated each other. They didn't want to know what each other was doing.
Well, not just regions, but families would just keep the secret.
Exactly. Right? And so today, he said, winemakers talk. They share everything. Maybe not everything, but a lot of it. And I think that's true in the whiskey area as well, in the distilling area, certainly in the beer area. All of those alcoholic beverages. There are now all these symposiums and yearly annual meetings, etc., where winemakers, distillers get together and they're telling each other what they're doing or trying or experimenting with, or, hey, don't do that. That doesn't work. That has never been the case before. And so I think that has helped catapult the quality and the taste value in the industry. So, and now you've got all this experimentation going on with the rebirth of the craft industry. And it's just fantastic. I mean, I have this one friend of mine, Rich Sursett, who is he's my boon traveling companion and guinea pig all at the same time, right? We pulled in one place. It was a barn and a still, and he went, "We drove all the way here for this. Where are you taking me?" But that's the fun of it, right? I mean, you can go anywhere and try some stuff, and sometimes it's great, and sometimes you're like, okay, well, that was fun. At least I learned something. We move on. Yeah. But it's always fascinating. It's always fascinating. It's never boring, and there's just so much going on, and the experimentation is happening. It's just an exciting time to be involved in brown spirits, period.
How much do we owe, for the golden age of rye, the use of enzymes? Because it's much more widely used, and especially with a lot of the varieties of rye that you're mentioning that were just really hard to work with. And you talk to distillers, they still have a hard time working with rye.
Well, I was going to say, so I mean, it's a really great point you're bringing up, and that's a big start to the whole rye thing. When I first talked to, what was my favorite quote? My favorite quote was, "You have to be a bit of a masochist to make rye." That was Jake Holshoe over at Rogue Spirits. Rye is the most difficult of all the grains to work with. And the reason is that it foams tremendously. And when that foam starts to cool and or dry, it's worse than Elmer's glue. It just becomes like hard plastic. And so he was telling me that Ralph Lorenzo was telling me that it was in the first year they were making rye, probably the first few months, they left a vat, and overnight the thing just literally just foamed over all over the distillery, and it took them 2 or 3 days to clean it up because they had no experience with how bad it was going to be. And so and even guys like Larry Ebersold, who was the master distiller at Seagram's for 20 years, had horror stories about making rye. So, and if you're at a big distillery, and when I say a big distillery, I'm talking about Hiram Walker, MGP, some of the really big places. You can't make rye for more than 2 or 3 weeks tops, and that's universal. Number one, it's not about putting it through the machinery, as you said, enzymes, and I will get to that, I promise. I've made it a little easier, but you still have to send it to the drying area, right? Because what a lot of people don't realize is that all that grain, especially from a big distillery, eventually goes into some kind of animal feed, farm feed, etc., and it's got to be dried out. Rye takes 5 times longer to dry than corn and barley. So you'll just ruin your entire drying area if you try to run rye more than a couple of weeks. You'll wear out your belts, you'll wear out your dryers. The stuff doesn't dry fast enough when they're trying to flip it over inside these large areas. So, these companies make a lot of money off their animal feed. So it's not just a byproduct they're throwing out. It's something they're repackaging that still has great value. So there are a number of reasons why rye is really difficult to work with. It's not just the foaming area. On the other hand, enzymes have made a huge difference, especially as the demand has grown. I mean, the running gag back in the mid 2000s was they spilled making more bourbon than they made of rye every year. And that was very true. And so the reason was there weren't enzymes at the time. It was really hard to make rye, and the demand wasn't there. So rye almost really went out of existence, except for, when they were doing it, they'd do like maybe 1,000 cases in a year, and that was it, which is nothing. And it's a drop in the bucket in the realm of some of these places.
Except for here in Alberta.
Exactly.
We kept it going.
But enzymes made a huge difference. I talked with several master distillers from the big places, and they said that was a huge turning point in the rye game because the enzymes kept that foaming down, and it made it easier for the breakdown of the starches into sugars. So that was a huge game changer. Yes. Now, on the other hand, there's a whole bunch of crafters that refuse to go that way, right? So they're still adding malted barley, or they still are adding malted rye to try to get that. And that's a little harder to do. There's no question about it.
And you have Eau Claire in your book as well. So they did this one rye, and Caitlin Quinn, the master distiller there,
right.
Head distiller, she doesn't like calling herself master distiller. She said she's never doing it again. They will never, ever have it, because she said, I'm not going to use enzymes, but it was the most disgusting couple days of her life.
It's very hard. It's very hard.
I picked up 3 more bottles because I believe her. And she's getting a bit mad.
We may have to make an off-camera trade later on.
It's a great rye. She did fantastic for her first rye. I love it.
No, it's amazing.
She just doesn't want to do it ever again.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of distillers who are just, as I said, Jake Holshue's quote to me was the one that every time I told that to another distiller, they always laughed.
Okay. But
so the enzymes, yes, they were a huge game changer.
I think so. But I'd like to find out from those in the industry. That's a question I'm going to keep asking people, I think, out there, just to see if that's it. Because they always come back to flavor. They say they want the more flavor. They want the punch of flavor. They need something to bring up the game a little bit or change their game. And rye seems to be one for a lot of people. But unless they love it, they don't seem to stick with it. Last Straw, who you also talk about in the book, they loved it. They got into the game, and that became their thing. So that they run with it. But the distilleries, the craft ones that kind of dabble in it a little bit, unless it goes well.
Rye's not something you dabble in. You have to have a passion to make rye, because otherwise it's just not worth it. That's why I say it's the heartbreak grain. It really is.
Well, we're going to change a little bit. We're going to go to rum. Let's talk about rum, because again, this is part of the history part of the book. And the first part of the book is mostly history. Got me right into the book right away, which I love. It's fantastic. So I'll read it. The popular choice of liquor in early colonial America had been rum, and had gained ground until the late 1700s. So slowly rum began to fall out of favor due to a number of restrictions, Molasses Act, Sugar Act, as well as France's declaration that no more rum be made in its new world possessions. So Carl, can you speak to this just a bit more? Because I'm having a hard time picturing this, because at that point in Canada, we have our Molson's distillery in Montreal making a vast amount of rum at that time. Mm-hmm. So was this just a U.S. issue, or just because we were still British?
There are also other factors, right? So number one, France stops making rum in its Western possessions. That's a big hurt. But in the 1700s and early and even up to the mid 1800s, even New England was still making a lot of rum. The problem is you have to buy sugar and make molasses, or you have to buy molasses and make that. It becomes a very expensive process. What happens is slowly over time, you need to start as your stores, your supplies start dwindling down, you need to come up with another product. Rye is right there. So, what happens is rye is readily available. It's cheaper. You can make more of it next year if you need to. And so that becomes part of the impetus of how whiskey starts to take over the spot of rum. And slowly rum becomes just too expensive to make at some point. And the flavor changes, right? You go from drinking sweet wine to dry wine. You've gone from making a sweet alcoholic beverage to a dry alcoholic beverage, and that's where you're headed. And that's kind of the evolution or de-evolution of how we get from rum to, because originally before even rum, there was, people were making hard cider as well in North America. And that was another good one. But eventually, it's easier to make whiskey, and it's cheaper.
And I'm just going back to our Canadian history. Generally, everything we make goes down to the States. We made most of our money selling to you guys. And our biggest 5 distilleries, which really built our country on the tax system.
Right.
That was sold mostly to you. And the rum, same thing. Sold mostly. So maybe I'm thinking that the rum, the sugar was cheaper, the molasses cheaper for us, just because of our link to
that's possible, because a lot of the laws that were passed were definitely meant to punish America.
Yeah,
the traitorous colonists.
But the French should have been there with you. The French.
No, the French had their own. The French had their own reasons. They didn't want to do anything that was going to help feed the British in any way.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm switching gears again, still with the history though, and we're going to talk about the Birth of Rye. That's the chapter, and it reminded me reading that chapter that everything is being studied. So when you go to university, you do your master's, you look around, everyone's done something. It's hard to find something, the little piece that no one's done. But this reminds me that everything's being studied, and it secured the notion in my mind that we can gain clarity on everything if we look deep enough. And I think you looked really deep on this European history of rye, because I don't know too many articles. And I did a cursory search, and this cursory search didn't come up with these articles. They came up with what you were talking about. So referenced you a lot with the European histories, which is nice. Was there one article that you found when you were looking that kind of brought all these other articles into light for you? Because I think that was a feat. For me, for a guy that's done a lot of research, I think the European history of rye might have been a feat that no one.
Thank you very much. It was not easy. I'm not going to lie. I'm going to say that I totally cheated. My first look into rye was a Google page, and I went, okay, so that's that, and that doesn't really lead you to many places, but it gave me some ideas, and so. To research rye, I abandoned the whole idea of whiskey. And I said, really what I need are agricultural histories. Okay. And that really brought a lot to what I was doing. So I looked at, this sounds incredibly boring and dry. I found it interesting, but I was pulling out small pieces as opposed to something else. But I went through a huge number of agricultural college, places where people published papers and theses and stuff like that. And so I was really doing a lot of graduate work in agricultural history. That's really what I did for about 2 months, was just nothing but reading agricultural histories from Rome all the way through to France, England, Scotland, and then eventually the New World. And that's kind of the way you figure it. And then I kind of worked backwards, actually, because the other great source of information was bakers and people who are interested in food history. Because rye is a grain. And so now you're finding out, well, what are people using rye for? Well, originally it was for beer and bread, and that's really what it came out to. And one of the really fascinating things, I've been reading about beer for 1,000 years and publishing beer books and what have you. Yeah. And there's the Rheinsberg or whatever the hell, however you pronounce it. I do apologize for the mispronunciation, but originally, it was a beer purity law saying, okay, you can't put pine tar in your beer and all that. But the truth behind it, too, was that everything was going into beer. And so they didn't have enough. They were going through these huge swaths of crop failures in grains for like 5 to 7 years at a time in 13th and 14th century 1300s and 1400s. So that's 14th and 15th century Europe. And so what happens is they pass these laws because they say, okay, you can make beer out of these grains, but they outlawed rye because you can make bread out of rye. People are starving. Yeah. Don't make beer with the rye, make bread with the rye. And so that's kind of really what it comes down to. And I found this in a baking history, not in a beer history or a whiskey history. So I had to approach it from a number of different odd kind of places to get to some of the information I was looking for.
And let's piggyback on that, because the 500th anniversary of that law was 2018, I think.
Right.
I didn't see anything in the beer world that kind of pushed that. And my first cousin works for a large brewery in this province. And I said, why are you not jumping on top of it? He said, geeks. The only people who understand this is geeks. Well, geeks buy beer, buddy. It's just we like our beer. But
oh yeah, there's a whole bunch of rye beers now.
Yeah, no.
It's making a small comeback as well.
I make a great Rogan beer. I do.
Oh, do you really? There you go. Look at that.
Last one, and it's heavy content. So, well, we talk about pounds. So I did this with 18 pounds of rye, 3 pounds of grain, and I used what's it called? You make porridge out of it, oats and some oats in there. It ended up being very, very good.
I was going to say oats add a little sweetness to it, kind of.
Yeah, it was, and the mouthfeel.
Nice.
The rye needs a little bit of the mouthfeel. It was fantastic.
Right.
And I was wrong. My fact checker
really
wife told me it was 1516, not 1518, so it doesn't matter.
There you go.
It's still 6 years ago. Nobody jumped on that bandwagon.
No.
The 500th anniversary, all you need is say that we use, well, they could have talked about hops because they were still allowed hops. You're using water, you're using barley, and you're using yeast. That's it. Well, actually, no, they said hops. They didn't talk about yeast because the yeast was natural then, right?
Right.
Back to whiskey. I'm sorry. So, was there something that really surprised you in all of these articles, or that you finally got to because you went to the history? But is there something that came out that was like, whoa, that makes no sense?
Well, it's kind of fascinating because really what it turned out, I mean, rye is a North American thing. It was born here and it is unique to North America. And they weren't making rye back in Scotland. They weren't making rye whiskey back in Scotland. That didn't happen. What happens is the colonists bring rye over, and you have to remember too, in the 1600s, spirits to the general populace were a new thing. In the medieval and Renaissance times, a number of different kings or barons, whatever royalty it was, they were ransacking abbeys and for their treasures, and they were putting these monks out of business, more or less. And most spirits up to that time were medicinal use only. They were truly medicine at that time. And so now you're a monk and you're out on the street and you're like, well, I got to make money. I got to make a living. And so they start selling, now that they've been ransacked, they start selling spirits to the populace, and it becomes a big thing. So when you come over when the colonists come over, whiskey is still not a big thing in Scotland at that point. It's not the thing that it eventually becomes. Everybody's still kind of experimenting. Which is why you have cider and rum, and you have all these different things that are just popping out. You know, you have gin, and what's the predecessor to gin was
aquavitae in there as well.
Yeah, you have aquavitae, and you have Geneva or whatever they call it. Yeah. So you have all these different things. It's not the uniform world that we're familiar with today, and that's where going back to the agricultural records was really fascinating, because this is going to sound incredibly dull, but I was going through the growing records of different counties in different states up and down the East Coast. So, for example, if you were a New England farmer or Canadian or New York, you had a very short season for corn, right? So you can only make so much corn, and it's not always the most it doesn't always reach its full potential in certain years, right? Wheat is second, but wheat's still not a huge winner in terms of its valuable commodity, but it doesn't always grow all that well in these climes. And then you hit rye, and rye, your soil can be acidic, it can be rocky, it can be complete crap. You can grow rye. It can be gray weather all winter. Don't worry about it. You're going to grow rye. And so at the end of the season, if you're a farmer, number one, you either sold your corn, you ate your corn, or your cows and your livestock ate your corn. Corn was a valuable commodity. Wheat went to baking. And so, and then to stretch out wheat, what farmers did was blend in rye with the wheat, which was meslin, and then you had rye. So when you had something left over, most northern farmers had rye left over, not corn as we might think. Mostly it was rye. So you're not going to be able to keep this rye, certainly not in colonial America, for very long. You've got to do something with it. You can make beer, but beer is going to spoil just as badly or worse than the grain. And so distilling the rye into whiskey is much easier. It's easier to cart around or move or store. You don't need to buy a hay barn. You could put it in a corner of the barn. And so that becomes, as spirits continue to grow in popularity, all of a sudden whiskey, and when I say whiskey, it's a pejorative because that could mean a number of things, but whiskey becomes a highly tradable commodity. And most of the whiskey from Canada all the way down to Pennsylvania and Maryland was rye, because that's what farmers had. And then when you start going south to Virginia and then down into Tennessee and Kentucky, now the farmers are growing a lot more corn. They can't grow enough rye. They can't grow enough rye to keep up with that. And so now you're making whiskey out of corn because that's your big seller. That's what you have left over at the end of the season. So it really comes out of the agricultural basis, the styles of whiskey that are being made, and et cetera. So that was kind of the fascinating thing. And like I said, the ultimate culmination is that rye is a North American phenomenon. It is our continental drink, whether you like it or not.
I like that. No, I do. I like that a lot. Let's talk about the IRS taxation documents, because I interviewed Todd Leopold from Leopold Brothers, and we talked about his rye he's making, the 3-chamber rye that I absolutely loved, and he got the idea from IRS documents. And I'm wondering, did you delve into these as well?
Absolutely.
And what do you get from these documents? Like he showed me certain things that he got from the documents, but it always led him to something else. What were you looking for when you're reading them?
Well, number one, I'm a history geek, so I'm just looking for something unique, etc. And the tax revenue documents it's just a window into a whole nother time and place. The government spent an inordinate amount of time and money, the U.S. government, to document the making of alcohol. Because as we were discussing just briefly earlier, and I'm sure we'll talk about later, most of the nation's revenue, especially from the turn of the century, the 1900s, all the way up till after World War II, much of it was based on liquor taxes. Excise taxes on wine, beers, and spirits. It's amazing. And matter of fact, the U.S. economy crippled itself because when they approved prohibition, nobody wanted to hear the fact that, like, look, all your revenue comes from booze. What are you people doing? Are you out of your mind? So that's a whole nother story. But the government said, if we're going to send out revenue collectors, they need to know how whiskey is made. And so they spent out a group of people, and I don't really know how many, Bob might know better than me. They sent out a group of people to understand how whiskey was made, and they diagrammed all the different kinds of stills that were being used pre-prohibition, because this was done in the early 1900s. And they have drawings, diagrams. They show you how a factory is should be set up or is set up, or the different ways it can be set up. They explain the entire process so that each one of these revenuers couldn't be bamboozled when they went to inspect a distillery. And it's a magnificent document for anybody who wants to learn about the history of distilling or just the process of distilling. It's all right there. And it can be gotten like that. I don't think too many people do it because it's just not all that, it's not exciting reading. It's certainly not scintillating reading, but it is fascinating reading if that's what you're looking for. And they certainly had a lot of information about the 3-chamber still. And this kind of goes back, just to, as you mentioned, Todd, when you say this is the golden age of rye. Number one, Todd brings back the 3-chamber still, which is a huge, huge thing, right? And on top of it, he works with East Austin, and now they just did the 3-chamber column combination rye that's being put out by George Dickel. And you sit there and you say to yourself, that's pre-prohibition. That's history right there in a bottle, because that's the stuff people were drinking before prohibition. That's why this is such an exciting time, because now not only are we drinking all this new stuff, but we can actually reach into the past and now taste the past. I mean, Dave Wondrich went completely, off a cliff about the new 3-chamber, but I mean, all Lou Bryson, all those guys were like, oh my God, this is a completely different world of whiskey now that we're tasting. So anyway, the documents are, for somebody like me, a true geek, they were fascinating. And Todd and I talked about that when I interviewed him. Yeah.
Well, you know what? The hour's done. We've been talking for an hour. I don't usually like ending off in our IRS documents and what you learn, but you know what? This is fascinating. The information you get and the history link, and you just said it really well. The innovation, but not just the innovation. Us being able to go back in history and pick
and
something
taste it,
and just get that sense of it from then. I think anyone with a sense of history or a love for your country, no matter what country it is, you can go back and taste something that was happening.
What it's all about.
It's there.
Doesn't get any better.
Well, whiskey brothers, whiskey sisters, whiskey friends, that's it. That's the first of the 3 whiskey book editions for this book. This book right here, The Spirit of Rye. Over 400 expressions to celebrate the rye revival and the golden era of rye, I would say. Yes, that's what I would say. We're moving our conversation from this more formalized format to an equally engaging but more conversation-based After Drams. So Carlo and fellow friend Davin de Kelshimo, author of this book right here, I'll punch his book. Well, 2 books, Canadian Whiskey.
Great book.
Which was my very first Whisky Book Club, by the way.
Great book.
The Definitive Guide to Canadian Distilleries, which was my
another great book.
The author to that's coming on with us. He'll be tagging along. Hopefully, I haven't talked to him today, but I'm pretty sure he's going to be there. If he's not, I'll look bad, but I have lots of questions regarding it. And what better activity is there than sitting down, talking, listening to people, and drinking some fantastic whiskey? So join us 5 to 7 minutes on this channel for the After Dram. If you don't want to miss a minute of us in the future, click like, click subscribe, and we will see you back here almost immediately. Thank you very much, everybody, and cheers. My dad hat's rye is almost gone. I'll have 2 new drams, I think. I don't know if I'm keeping up, but I'm doing well. Thank you very much. Cheers, everybody. Slancha.